What is up, gamers? In this video, I'll be going over a concept that I don't think is very much talked about in Vanguard, and that is deck archetypes. So what do I mean by a deck archetype? A deck archetype is the type of playstyle the deck wants to play. This video is to teach you how to identify and play as and against those types of decks. Misaligning what type of deck you are playing or playing against and playing it improperly will be very devastating on the game will go for you. So we'll hop into the first one, which is aggro deck. Aggro is usually the easiest one to grasp. It basically means aggressive. So your deck is trying to win as fast as possible and not let the opponent have any room to breathe. Usually these types of decks do something very unfair early on, and they do it at the cost of different resources. And with these powerful early games, they want to be able to rip apart the opponent's hand and make them very uncomfortable. They'll usually value having board presence over hand size whenever they're trying to accomplish this. Usually, the longer the game goes, the harder it becomes for the aggro deck. So a couple of examples of this. Yo Asakura. This deck, in my mind, is the definition of how an aggro deck should be. Yo has probably the strongest grade 2 game in the format because they have access to the ride line, giving them a free 13k booster behind the Vanguard, and then also the grade 2 being a 15k beater that draws a card. So that's a 28k Vanguard swing. And then they usually are able to call out Jocos that call out Mikes, which they swing for 23 and also make the opponent reveal cards from their hand. And then they utilize this momentum to be able to push super hard with the Vanguards. And because usually with the early game, they're able to push the opponent to a higher damage count, their Vanguard has access to a restand if their attack doesn't hit. If you don't block early and try to block later, Yo is able to punish that by having multiple Vanguard swings. What Yo usually sacrifices is the hand size, because a lot of the cards don't actually generate them advantage. They usually go 1-for-1 on the card advantage. So they'll usually have a smaller hand size than a lot of other decks. Because it's a Shaman King deck, a lot of the spirit cards have 0 crit. So they have access to less attackers than normally. But for the most part, Yo is what I define as an aggro deck. So moving on, we have control. So control is the polar opposite of aggro. So control decks are usually decks that want to slow the pace down, make the game last as long as possible. And they usually have tools to be able to control the field and be able to stop attacks easier. And they usually have very solid card advantage generators to be able to get enough cards in their hand to be able to last through the game. So one example is Bhavsagra. So Bhavsagra is, to me, what like a pure control deck looks like. In the early game, the deck doesn't really do much. They can call some Rias if they want. It's like this because a lot of the cards require you to either be on Bhavsagra or have arms. So the deck is looking to get to turn 3 to start really ramping up, since then they can use the spear to equip the shield, and then they'll be able to call trick moons for counter charge and then have a really big Vanguard swing. And then whenever they have the double equip, they are able to blow up the front row each and every turn and gain a crit. Every time they arm a card, then they're able to revive something and soul charge. So Bhavsagra gives the deck a lot of ways to punish the opponent if they aren't getting rid of the front row each turn. So you're able to keep clearing the front row out and make them have to keep committing new cards, while also being a very big Vanguard swing, while also being able to revive cards from your drop so you don't lose out on advantage. And then the deck itself has a lot of revival effects between Bhavsagra, Ayushna, and Shabda. Even if the opponent clears your field, it doesn't super matter for you because Bhavsagra can revive a card, Ayushna can revive a card, Shabda can revive itself if something else was revived. So you can very easily build a board out of nothing. And then one of the cool defensive things this deck has that nothing else does is the shield equip. So the shield is able to give Bhavsagra a 10k shield every single turn. So you're able to not have to use any of the cards in your hand to be able to guard attacks. One of the weaknesses it has is that it's very piece reliant. If you don't have Spear, Shield, and Trick Moon on turn 3, the deck is a lot weaker. Bhavsagra's early game is not very strong. You can call units down and they'll be vanillas, but there's no plays the deck can make early on. Now that we talked about aggro and control, let's talk about midrange. So midrange is the in-between of aggro and control. They have tools to be able to either slow the game down or speed it up, depending on what the matchup and game state are. Mid-range decks are considered to be jack of all trades, so they can do basically any style, but they aren't better at a style than decks within that style. So they can be an aggro deck if they need to be, but they will almost never out aggro a pure aggro deck. And then vice versa with control, you will never outgrind a control deck. Our example for mid-range is Kyrie. So Kyrie is the most mid-range I can think of within standard. The deck just has a bit of everything. It will hit some solid numbers. It has pretty solid draw power from Melty, and it has very easy multi-attack it can accomplish. Nothing Kyrie does, however, is better than any other deck. A lot of decks have stronger numbers, stronger multi-attack, and more draw power. Kyrie has the options to do any of those, unlike a lot of other decks. So if we compare the Nirvana, for example, Nirvana has stronger numbers through Esperdea gaining power and Mahar giving power, but Nirvana has usually less attacks and less draw power than Kyrie can get, and has a little bit of a weaker early game than Kyrie. So because of all the options Kyrie has, it is able to change the pace of the game to where you can slow down the game and draw a bunch off Melty and triple drive off Kyrie, or you can speed it up with the ride line being as aggressive as it is. And through the amount of draw power this deck can get, it gives it more options than most decks usually get. One of the big things Kyrie isn't as good at is if it falls behind, it is kind of hard to recover. There's not really any recoverability the deck gets. It's just drawing more cards off Melty and triple driving. And the deck doesn't really have like a big win con. You see in a lot of other decks, the win con is pretty apparent. So if we compare it to Nirvana again, Nirvana's win con is having really big Esperdeas and speed over the opponent, while Kyrie, its finishing play is just 5 attacks. Those are the main 3 archetypes that you'll see. Most decks will fall into one of those categories, but there are some that will fall into one of these other 2 categories. So next we're going to do combo. So combo decks are pretty similar to control decks, where they're trying to reach a specific point in the game. Some of the big differences though is that control decks usually have forms of disruption or can pivot from their usual game plan, while combo decks don't have nearly as much disruption, and they basically have to do that combo or they will lose. But once they reach the combo, the game becomes massively in their favor, or they sometimes just win the game on the spot. There's not many in standard right now. The main one is Barrow Magnus. So usually in other card games, combo decks are like a big combination of cards where you can make like an infinite loop or just auto win the game right there. In Vanguard, it's not necessarily that most of the time. Usually in Vanguard, combo decks are big advantage engines. Barrow Magnus fits in that boat, where for Barrow Magnus to be at full power, it needs to be at 15 soul. So you play a bunch of cards that mass soul charge to try to reach 15 soul as soon as you hit turn 3. Once it gets to that, it becomes a very powerful deck where you're constantly swinging with 5 attacks with a 23k 2-crit Vanguard swing, and you draw a card off of it, and you constantly board wipe the opponent. So this deck just wants to hit that 15 soul to be able to get all of those benefits. One of the things it struggles with though, since all of their deck is basically pieces to get to 15 soul, they will struggle if they get aggroed a bit. So an aggro or mid-range deck can hit into them and try to force pieces out of their hand or put them at a high damage count to where they have not enough room to recover once they hit their big combo. And then one other thing Barrow Magnus struggles with is sometimes you just don't get the 15 soul. And if you don't get the 15 soul, then the deck becomes massively weaker, and then it starts struggling to keep up. The last archetype I want to talk about is tempo. So explaining tempo is pretty weird because it sounds a lot like an aggro deck. So tempo decks basically want to get an advantage early on and then hold that advantage constantly throughout the rest of the game. Tempo decks do this by having cards that can tutor into other cards or have a ton of filtering to get to the cards they need. And they also have access to a solid early game to be able to grab the game pace and then keep it. They basically try to stay one step ahead the entire time, where they don't overcommit too much, but they have to commit just enough to be able to get enough pressure to cross the finish line. Mahar Nirvana. So Mahar can't be an aggro deck because they have very conditional rear guards that you have to call by having to overdress them over trick stars. But whenever you get to the overdress, their abilities become a lot stronger, and they'll typically be more effective than most other rear guards in other decks. The deck has a Pot of Greed through Arcs, and then they also have a lot of ways to recover cards from their drop zone through being able to revive Trickstar off either of the Nirvanas or having that Suji to grab overdressed units from your drop to your hand. So you're able to recover resources you've lost throughout the game. And then the big thing Mahar has that no other grade 4 deck has is Amelia, where you can cheat into grade 4, even going second. So no matter what, you're gonna hit grade 4 before the opponent hits their grade 4 Persona ride, which gives the deck a lot more control on how it wants to play through the game. Once they hit grade 4, then that's a massive power spike for the deck because they get triple drive, they get access to Esperidaea, and they get a free damage ping off of Mahar. So they're able to start putting massive pressure on the opponent and be able to control the pace of the game from there on. Some of the weaknesses the deck has is it's very piece reliant. So you need to find Mahar, you need to find an Esperidaea. If you're going second, you need to find an Amelia. So naturally the deck just wants to see a lot of different cards at specific times. And then most of the cards in this deck do require Counterblast. So the opponent has a little bit more control over your damage to be able to control how many plays you can make during your turn. But going to a high damage count early on for this deck is not so bad because you have so many ways to utilize that Counterblast to be able to catch up in the game. And that is about it for this video. So you need to understand how a deck is supposed to play and what type of archetype they are to be able to play with or against that deck better. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.